One of the curious things about the world before Corona was that growth rates, particularly amongst the so-called developed economies, were in secular decline.
A major milestone for the Dow.
The U.S. unemployment rate has reached its lowest level in 5 decades.
So much so that we had this disconnect where stock markets were booming everywhere.
Demand for money. Buy. Demand for homes.
Yet wages were stagnant. The general feeling of prosperity for many populations was shrinking. And we saw this with the populist reaction and all the rest.
Donald Trump says he's a champion of the middle class. That's the whole point of his campaign, he says.
We all assume that tomorrow's going to look like today. We all assume that everything's going to be fine. And if 2008 taught us one thing, that's not true.
The coronavirus pandemic will cause the worst global economic fallout since the Great Depression.
Another 2.1 million Americans filed for unemployment, pushing the total past 40 million since March.
This is the most rapid economic contraction probably in the history of the world. We had no shock absorbers. We didn't know where the next bump in the road was going to come from, but we did know that the tools to deal with it were really not there.
So let's try and think systematically about this. How exactly do countries or economies tackle the underlying components of GVA, gross value added, to get GDP? So if you're Greece, it's beaches, a services export. If you're Germany, it's the auto sector, selling cars around the world. Europeans are open economies. It means that most of your growth comes from external sources. Open economies tend to have bigger welfare states. It's a type of shock absorber. When you're hit with something like Corona, they still have those infrastructures in place. That means that the Danish, who are a heavily export-dependent country, everything from bacon to high-tech components, they can turn around and say to everybody, right, everybody at home are going to pay 80% of wages, because we have the infrastructure to do that.
Denmark locked down early, and they're a lot closer to emerging from all this than most countries.
Pretty much all of Europe has that. And if you look at the United States, we are consumption-driven, very services-dependent.
The great American consumer, which has been the pillar of the economy thus far.
We're really about 30% export dependent.
U.S. economy right now more dependent on consumer spending than it has been in years.
The basic growth model does not allow you to slow down and sequester the economy for 6 months. There's no equivalent set of institutions. The analogy I like to use for this is the United States is basically a 6-liter Mustang GT.
It just screams America.
So long as it's heading in a straight line and so long as all the components are perfectly aligned and everything is working great, it's amazing. But if you try and stop it suddenly, everything flies off. If it has to do lockdowns, if it has to do partial openings, if it has to do restarts over the next few months, it's a disaster. But if you open up the economy and try and restart it all at once, you destroy your health system, which is 20% of US GDP. Europe, on the other hand, Europe's a bit like a Volvo.
Every Volvo has 6 steel pillars, like this.
It's got airbags everywhere. It's really comfortable. If you have to sleep in it for 6 months, you can. And if you crash in it, you'll probably live.
Here's what I've been thinking. What's the one thing when you think of Volvo that comes to mind? Safety. Exactly.
The rich economies with large welfare states have a particular set of Volvo-like absorbers. It costs a lot of money to run these things, like it does to run a Volvo. I know, I've got one. And most of the time, we don't need these institutions. Most of the time, you don't drive with the airbags. You don't even think about the airbags. But you're very grateful when you have that crash. And you see this in the European response. What do? You backstop the banks and you say, keep paying wages, pay it at 80%. We basically just decided not to do that. Now, what is it the Congress is doing? They're making damn sure that the financial power of the state is being used to bail out the corporate sector.
What did the Senate majority fight for? One of the largest corporate bailouts with as few strings as possible in American history.
Because the Fed, all the way through from the financial crisis right to the present, kept basically interest rates very, very low. And that meant so long as corporates were in positive growth territory, they could issue tons of debt and do lots of stock buybacks. And now all those debts have gone and went, it's the Fed's job to buy them. They're buying steaming piles of corporate junk. Now, over here we've got American people. They're desperate. Look at the food bank lines, for God's sake, 5 miles in some places, right? This place is in crisis point, and we're still kind of behaving as if it's okay, and we'll be getting back to work soon. We've basically stripped all the airbags out, turbocharged the engine, and went Yahoo. Now, there's one big airbag at the front, what you see with the bailouts, and you know who that's for. But everybody else in the back of the car, yeah, you're kind of screwed.
Absolutely, this pandemic has magnified the problems that people were already having.
The death toll in the U.S. now officially topping 110,000.
African-American deaths from COVID-19 are 2 times greater.
Health officials are worried a second wave of coronavirus may be worse than the first.
Can I imagine a more positive future? Yes. One whereby there are safety nets that people occasionally access that don't throw them out on the trash heap, that isn't asymmetrically paid off to people who already have everything. My fear is that we crash the Mustang and we try and restart the engine 3 or 4 times before we realize we need to build a Volvo.